So without further ado, I think we will get started. So we are looking at this painting by Sandro Botticelli, painted in the 1480s, and it depicts Venus and Mars. That is the title and the date. The dimensions of this painting are, it's almost 2 meters wide by about 70 meters high. So it's a strange kind of rectangular format. And here in this National Gallery image, you can see it actually in its frame, which is always really lovely because you get a sense of the painting as an object, which of course is so easy to forget when we're looking at these works on our computer screens. But thankfully, this one is easy for us, or most of us who are in the UK, to see because it hangs in the National Gallery for free. So it's painted in oil and tempera, which is egg yolk mixed with a colored pigment on poplar panel. And as we've learned in previous sessions, poplar is the support that tends to be used in Southern Europe, with oak being a preferable support for Northern Europe for obvious reasons, that poplar is, of course, native to the south and oak is native to the north of the continent. What do we have in the most basic terms when we're looking at this picture? We have two figures lying on the ground. On the left, we have a female figure. She is not quite in profile. She's in 3/4 profile, we would say, her head at least. And she's reclining, leaning back on her right arm, with her left hand draped elegantly over her left knee. And we have a glimmer of her left foot on a bed of soft, squishy grass, which extends into the right-hand side of the painting. She is pretty much fully draped, in the sense that we can't see much of her body. She's wearing this beautiful diaphanous dress, which we'll look at in more detail shortly. But the artist has taken great care in depicting every individual fold of the dress to give a real sense of its transparency or translucency, and the thin nature of the material from which it's made. If we move over to the other side of the painting, we see another figure who, conversely, is rather undressed. This is a male figure who is almost in the nude, reclining sort of in a mirroring format. So he's leaning back on his left arm, his right hand is falling limply at his groin, and his right foot has crossed over his left foot, and he is leaning back in a very, very relaxed, indolent pose, with his head tilted back, and we can see right up his nose. He is completely lost in another world, and that is the world of slumber. So we have these two figures, one draped, one female, one almost nude with a piece of fabric covering his groin, and male. And then around them, we have a very luscious landscape. We have two trees either side defining the two edges of the picture. So she is set against a tree and some foliage, and he is also set against a tree, some leaves we see behind him, but significantly and importantly, we can see this tree stump, which we're going to have a little closer look at in a short while. And behind him and her, but closest to him, are 4 child satyrs. So we looked at some satyrs last week in our session on pain while we were looking at Titian. These are far more playful satyrs, younger, and they are having a jolly good time. There are 3 at the back, all hanging off what is a long lance. The one at the back is wearing a helmet that has covered his whole head because it's obviously far too large for him. The one in the middle is looking back at him and laughing at how ridiculous he looks. And the one at the front has taken hold of a conch shell and is trying to wake this man from his deep sleep. Underneath the arm, the left arm of the reclining male, is another satyr who is trying to fit into the breastplate of a grown man's armor. So you're probably picking up that these pieces of armor that are far too big for these tiny children are in fact the armor belonging to the man who we can very easily see has lost it. And for those of you that don't know and didn't manage to join last week, satyrs are half goat, half man. So that's what we're looking at here. And they're notoriously playful and slight mischief makers. And we can very much see that in this painting. What else? There's beautiful grass in the foreground, which we can see is so meticulously painted. Every single strand of grass is painted, and huge care is taken in depicting the foliage, as we can see in the drapery of the lady. Every single detail has been thought about. Also, look at the gilding on the dress of the lady, and also the pattern on this cushion, this very comfy looking cushion on which she reclines. It's an incredibly carefully painted painting, and it's electric with wonderful color as well. Very fresh color palette with these lovely red and pink tones to brighten up an otherwise pastoral and quite neutral palette. So the question is, who are we looking at here? Now, the title gives that away, probably. We're looking at Mars on the right and Venus on the left, accompanied by 4 anonymous satyrs. Who are these people? Venus is the goddess of love. I'm sure many of you know that. And we can see there, not only is she the goddess of love, she's the goddess of beauty. This is an extraordinarily beautiful woman by, I'd say, not only 15th century standards, but certainly by any standards. It certainly was the archetypal beauty, Florentine Renaissance beauty, this blonde hair, fair skin, and of course this perfectly proportioned face. But it is indeed, she is indeed very, very attractive to the contemporary, to the modern eye as well, and equally a very attractive looking man with a perfectly defined classical torso and these long, luscious curls. This is Mars, the god of war, which probably gives you helps you understand why there are these pieces of armor that are scattered around him. And what are we looking at? We are looking at a moment in the story of the two, of Venus and Mars. They were not, in fact, legitimate, shall we say, lovers. Venus and Mars had an illicit relationship. They had an affair. Venus was married to Vulcan, who was the blacksmith of the gods, and it was a very ill match. She is, as we can see, beautiful and the goddess of love, and he was old and lame and certainly not the right fit for such a young beauty. And so unfortunately, rather predictably, she ends up having an affair with Mars, the famously handsome god of war. And this is a scene from that episode, that story. What happens? Well, they do end up having an affair, coming together in shall we say, passionate union. And Vulcan, the husband of Venus, discovers them. They are actually together in their marital bed, and he, being the blacksmith that he is, creates a net made out of very, very fine chains, so fine, in fact, that when he throws it over the pair, they aren't even aware that they have been caught in the act, quite literally. So they were caught in Vulcan's net. And when they were caught, Vulcan called all of the gods from, or in fact, I think asked Venus's father, Jupiter, to call all of the gods from Mount Olympus and come and laugh at them having this illicit affair. So this is the story from antiquity or from Greek mythology. It's told a number of times throughout antiquity. And it's often depicted in the Renaissance. Obviously, it's a moralizing story and is often depicted around the theme of marriage, or around the moment of marriage or union between two parties. However, it's often shown, particularly in the 16th century, the moment of this passionate embrace is often the moment that is depicted. However, here we don't have the moment of the passionate embrace. We have a very, very calm moment, probably, judging by the position of Mars, probably the moment post this passionate union. And we have quite a beautiful scene. So even though this is a passionate painting, we are not actually looking at that moment of passion. What we are looking at is, in fact, quite a humorous scene and something that's incredibly beautiful and pleasing to the eye. Now, the context of this painting is quite important in understanding it for a number of reasons. The first is its strange shape. So while the shape of the support of the panel is incredibly appropriate for depicting two reclining figures, it is in fact the other way around, in that this shape, these figures would have been fit into this shape of support. And that is because this style of painting is known as a spalliera, which comes from the Italian word spalla, which means shoulder, and spalle means shoulders, and spalliera means that this is the name that's given to this painting, meaning that it would have sat at shoulder height, which for most of us, that's quite high for a painting. And that is because it was set into the paneling of a room. So often if you visit galleries and you see a number of these rectangular sort of landscape format paintings on panel, on wood, that is because they were originally part of an interior decorative scheme, a furniture scheme. Now, we don't actually have, I don't think, any spalliere left in their original position, which is a great shame because they suddenly become paintings when they're out of context, but they would in fact have been part of an interior decorative scheme. And it's also relevant that this was a spalliera because spalliere were often in a certain room in a Florentine palace, and that was known as a camera, or as it's translated, a bedroom. a bedchamber. And this would have been, as in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, this would have been not only where you sleep, in fact, not often where you sleep. This was a place for showing your most important guests, paintings in your collection, not only mythological paintings like this one, but portraits of the family. It was a place to display your wares. But it was used as the marital bedroom. So it was used really for the conception of children between a married couple. So this adds an extra level of significance to this painting, both in terms of its, of course, its subject matter, which is incredibly moralizing. We have Venus, the god of beauty, or goddess of love, sorry, who has conquered Mars, god of war. So we have love conquering war, which more generally is generally a sort of philosophical meaning to this painting. But we also have the idea of love, incredibly beautiful, very chastely dressed. This is a symbol of fidelity. This lady is a symbol of fidelity. She is fully dressed. She's chaste. She's a symbol of chastity. And then we have this nude male figure, which has significance because it was traditionally thought that the woman would conceive a male heir, which was, of course, the preferred gender, I'm sorry to say, in the 15th century, because it, of course, continued the line of the family. She was more likely to conceive a male heir if she was looking at the image of a beautiful male. So this was a very appropriate place for a painting such as this, for reasons stated above. So there are many layers of meaning to this painting, and unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of time to go into the real nitty-gritty of this painting this evening, but it's unbelievably famous. I'm sure a number of you have seen it before, and that's for good reason, and that's largely because of these quite esoteric Neoplatonic interpretations of the painting. This was not only relevant for the reasons that we've described just there in terms of its context and subject matter, but it was also for those very important people that came into the camera. This was a painting that would have had great humanist meaning, and for the patron showing whoever it was around their house, this would have had an additional layer of, this would have been made an impression, a great impression on their visitor, for its intellectual properties as well. That's not only because, of course, it's the story of Venus and Mars, it's Greek mythology, something that, of course, in the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical antiquity was hugely valued, but also because there are sort of further meanings to this painting. For example, the iconography of this painting with these playful satyrs, which we're going to turn to now, in fact mimics the text written by a Greek poet or historian called Lucian, who is telling the story of a painting, or he's describing a painting of the marriage of Alexander the Great to Roxana, his wife. And during the marriage, or in the painting, there are a handful of playful putti. So in that case, Cupid, sort of little cherubs, playing with Alexander's armor. So that reference, if you are incredibly learned, which of course a number of people of this elite class in Florence would have been, if you were incredibly learned, you may have recognized that as the reference here. And there are a number of contemporary references that are drawn upon in this painting as well, from contemporary literature and poetry. And that is because the artist, Sandro Botticelli, was mixing in these circles, these very, very high elite humanist circles in Florence. Before we start talking about Botticelli himself, I just want to have a little closer look at these putti. So I think one thing that Botticelli does so beautifully in this painting, as well as the meticulousness of the way in which he draws the bodies, the way in which he executes the line. I mean, you can almost see the underdrawing, the drawn line of these perfectly sculpted forms. But what he does conjure up so well in this painting is not only what we're seeing, but also what other senses the painting brings to us. So most notably, of course, noise. And we get that most obviously around the head of Mars. So we've seen this satyr holding this conch shell and blowing it in the ear of Mars, trying to wake him up from this post-coital slumber. But nothing is appearing to stir him. We can see his cheeks are straining this poor little satyr, trying to wake him up, but he is completely out for the count. And this slightly wide, darkened nostril and these almost twitching eyes really do give us the impression that Mars is snoring. So in one moment, we have noise coming from this painting. On the far right, I want to also draw your attention to these insects. Now, these are, of course, most of our worst insect. This is the wasp, and there are a collection of them, and it looks like their nest has been disturbed by either his head or the noise of his snoring or the conch shell, but they are taking flight and buzzing around Mars's head as well. So he's not stirring from the noise of the conch shell. He's making a lot of noise himself, and he's also not stirring from the buzzing of these many wasps that are flying around his head, and he doesn't seem bothered by these pesky creatures either. The wasps in the painting do carry extra significance. For those of you who do speak Italian or know a few Italian words, this is probably a word that many of you do know, whether you speak Italian or not, and that is Vespa, because that is, of course, the name of the famous motorino, the little moped. And Vespa in Italian means wasp, which of course is why the motorbike or the moped was called a Vespa, because it does the buzzing noise when it scoots along the roads. But these here, the plural being Vespe, these Vespe may be, and almost and very likely are to be, the evidence that this painting was painted for a family called the Vespucci family, who were an elite Florentine family, patrician family in Florence. And we know that they had paintings by Botticelli in their Florentine palazzo, because we're told so by Giorgio Vasari, the great biographer of the artists, in his 1550 book of the lives of the artists. And he talks about, in Botticelli's biography, he talks about how many families in Florence had paintings by Botticelli, including the Vespucci. And an additional point to make is that this upper corner is often where a coat of arms would be placed in a painting. So that may be further evidence that this is a reference to the commissioning family. I'm just going to move us slowly across. So behind Mars, we've seen there is a tree, maybe a laurel tree. Also just note the echo of these gorgeous auburn curls in the curls of the hair of the satyr, and also in his furry legs. And then obviously that theme continues as we move further back. But I also just wanted to draw attention to this satyr here, this beautifully executed armor with this dab of white paint to give the impression, of course, of the light catching a very smooth metal surface. And then this slightly grainy sort of brass color here to give a sense of a sort of different texture of metal. But this, as with the Vespe, you know, with the wasps, this would have been an added and another humorous touch to the painting, the way this helmet has dropped over this sweet child's, mischievous child's head. But the tree behind the figure of Venus is probably a myrtle tree. So that, or maybe a myrtle tree, and that might also be reference to its function as a marriage painting to celebrate the marriage of members of the family, the commissioning family, as myrtle was representative or is symbolic of marriage. But there are also elements in this painting that are sort of playful in a different way and intended to kind of sort of deceive the viewer. So if we look closely at the figure of Venus, you can see that her hair is beautifully plaited in this very typical Botticellian way, of course, that was so admired by the pre-Raphaelites of the 19th century, which is really when this painting started gaining any sort of recognition, since the 15th century when it was painted. But we can see how her hair that's plaited is sort of plaited into her dress. So the idea that her hair is also the embroidery and decoration on her dress sort of further emphasizes this this symbol, that she is the symbol of chastity. This dress is inescapable in a way. And on this theme of chastity, actually, it's really interesting to look at the gilding on her dress as well. Notice the very, very fine way in which Botticelli has painted this gilding. It looks like it's painted with gold leaf to give the impression that it is actually a kind of metal substance. You know, again, this idea of being sort of locked in by this, quite literally by this metal decoration. But what's interesting here is the Botticelli sort of revealing, shall we say, his early training as a goldsmith. And that is where he starts out. He starts out as a goldsmith, we think, and then he goes to train with a painter, one of the best known painters in Florence in the 15th century, Fra Filippo Lippi. So that brings us on quite nicely, and of course the gilding continues on the pillow here. That brings us on quite nicely to talk a little bit about Botticelli and where this comes in the artist's career. So in case you hadn't realized, this painting is painted at the absolute peak of Botticelli's career as an artist. It was painted in the 1480s, around the mid 1480s, and his peak really is in the 1470s, late 1470s to the early 1480s. And it was in this period that he paints not only this painting, but perhaps two other paintings that are more familiar to you, which is the Birth of Venus in the Uffizi Gallery, and also the Primavera. So his two enormous paintings, probably painted for the Medici, who were his sort of most major patrons and close acquaintances. Lorenzo the Magnificent being the de facto ruler of Florence. So where did he start? Botticelli, he's born in Florence and he lives in Florence for his whole life. So he really is the archetypal Florentine painter from the Renaissance. He and I think probably all of us sort of think of him as such. He was born in the Santa Maria Novella district, which is one that if you've been to Florence, you almost certainly would have been to, because it's where the train station is. And so he was born in that area. And his father was a tanner, so sort of dyeing and treating leather hides of animals, obviously for leather, which Florence is still known for today. And he was born to three. He had three brothers. He was one of four boys, and his name, Sandro Botticelli, actually comes from one of his brothers. One of his brothers was given the nickname Botticello, and this is a nickname that was taken up by Alessandro di Mariano di Filippetti, which is Botticelli's full name. Alessandro was shortened to Sandro, so it became Sandro Botticelli, i.e. of the Botticellos. And Botticello means little barrel or wine cask. And I think this was a reference to his size, his brother's size. So Botticelli is actually derives from a nickname for his brother, which is quite a nice fact. And he trains with Fra Filippo Lippi. He goes to train with him at about the age of 18, which is quite late. Normally you would start an apprenticeship at sort of 12, 13, but he'd been working as a goldsmith with his brothers. And he sets up his own studio in 1470 in Florence. And it's a year later that he sort of paints one of his first major works, the figure of Fortitude. And then in the 1470s, he really sort of picks up painting portraits. He paints, of course, devotional paintings, mythological paintings. He paints sort of across genres. And in 1481, he's actually invited to Rome, and it's the one time that Botticelli leaves Florence, really, as far as we know, to go to Rome in the autumn of 1481. He's invited by Sixtus IV, the Pope, so no small invitation, with a handful of other very successful and well thought of artists, Florentine Tuscan artists, to go and decorate the walls of the Sistine Chapel, no less. So Botticelli heads to Rome in the autumn of 81, and he returns in the autumn of 82. So he's there for a year, and he paints three scenes on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. One wall depicts scenes from the life of Christ. The other wall depicts scenes from the life of Moses. And they're painted by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, all very well thought of artists from this period. And Botticelli paints three scenes, and these are fresco. So this is a technique, of course, that you paint pigment into wet plaster. So it's very, very difficult technique, and one that one must be trained in. And this is a technique that Botticelli picked up when he was training with, would have learned when he was training with Fra Filippo Lippi. So he works in Rome, and then he returns in the early 1480s. And this is the period, as I say, that he paints he's sort of peaking, really. And he paints this and his triumvirate of paintings, this and the two mythological scenes in the Uffizi. So we really are very lucky to have this painting in England, given that it is sort of thought of really as one of his sort of three major paintings, I'd say. I'm sure that's debated by a number of people, but I do think that these three paintings, the Primavera and the Birth of Venus, are really thought of generally to be Botticelli's most famous and significant works. And so how did it end up with us? Aren't we lucky? So the painting was in Florence, maybe painted for the Vespucci, we think. And it's only really until the 19th century that it sort of comes to light, sort of, in terms of it comes into the public eye. It was bought by an English art dealer and collector, a man called Alexander Barker, who was in Florence in the second half of the 19th century. And sort of only a few years after he acquired it, in the 1870s, he had a major sale of his works at Christie's, and this painting was acquired by the National Gallery, along with the Nativity, the Unfinished Nativity by Piero della Francesca, which we've talked about on one of our sessions before, our series on the Christmas story, which is available online on our website if you didn't see it. But both of those paintings were acquired by this man, sold in his sale, and acquired by the National Gallery. But the 19th century was really Botticelli's moment, as I'm sure many of you know, and as we've referenced already. This was the moment that the Pre-Raphaelites were, of course, honing in on anything, as the name suggests, pre-Raphael. And that really says it all. I mean, after Botticelli dies in 1510, his painting sort of fades into, well, I'd say actually Raphael dies in 1520, so only 10 years later. And then you have a period, what's known as Mannerism, that really sort of peaks in the 1530s. And Mannerism was all about sort of elegant, sort of elongated forms, and sort of soft curving lines. So paintings like this actually were still very appealing to a kind of Mannerist context. However, after that, when you move into the naturalism that creeps in with Caravaggio in the 17th century, and then we won't carry on. But Botticelli actually does sort of his fame fades, and this is also due to the narrative that's laid out by the great biographer Giorgio Vasari, who, while he says that Botticelli is good, this generation of artists were apparently too obsessed with detail, and that the artists such as Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo, who come to sort of define what is known as the High Renaissance, they were really the artists that sort of kept hold of artistic excellence, sort of in line with meaning, whereas Vasari saw the previous generation of Quattrocento artists as getting lost in the detail. And so Vasari's narrative has very much come to define, or came to define, the narrative of the history of art, really. However, it had, of course, in the 19th century, in the second, or towards the end of the 19th century, with the Pre-Raphaelites, Botticelli was held up as the greatest artist, really, of all time. And that's why we have a resurgence of of pictures that don't look dissimilar to this, and women that don't look too dissimilar to this either.